Resolution in Faith. As told to Daniel Vayu by Bishop Benjamin Bergstrom. It was the month of March in the year 1953. My twin sister Sanjessica Bergstrom and some 3 of our friends who were archaeologists were on a private plane coming from doing some missionary work in northern Africa for 3.5 weeks. I was no more than 2 years into being a priest. I was 21 years old, the same as my sister. My sister was a nun for about 4 years at the time. We were in the air for about 2 hours. It was the early evening and we were flying over the Sahara Desert. My sister was sitting next to me as we both looked out of the window at the sun setting in the west against the dark blue star-struck sky. We were talking about how beautiful the sight of the sun gracing the desert plain. It was striking the desert floor and it looked as the most beautiful oil painting of Nimbus cinnamon red and orange we have ever seen. We both were stunned at the moment the sun was going down as it peaked its last seconds of shine over the desert hills. It was simply breathtaking. We had a pilot by the name of Philip Sanjorna, who had been with us since the beginning of our missionary travels. He was a very generous and kind man. He never allowed us to pay him for our travels. He was well off, as most would assert in those times. His uncle, who passed away 17 years earlier, gave him an airplane company with about only 8 planes to manage. He would rent them to people for trips, but he never charged us. He told me that the learning experience was enough for him. I miss his presence until this very day, this moment as I speak of him. He was a rare soul. It was about another 40 minutes into the flight I had noticed that we were flying kind of slower and lower than we were on the outstart. Our altitude had dropped a lot and I was able to feel the heat from the desert more as than before. I told my sister that I was going to go and see what was happening. I got up and went to the cockpit of the plane. I knocked on the door and Philip told me to come in. I went in and noticed that he was sweating a lot as he looked at me. I asked him if he was okay. He told me yes. He asked me if I would get him a glass of water so he could take his medication. Philip was a diabetic. I told him yes. I got him some water and he took his medication. I asked him if it were anything else I could do. He told me that he was fine. I went back to sit down next to my sister. About 2 hours later the plane began to swerve and go up and down. It was hard to see because it was then night over the Sahara Desert. All we could see was the early night sky going darker and the moonlight striking the desert sands. My sister looked at me in a panic. I told her to remain calm. I got up from my seat and struggled to the cockpit of the plane. I opened the door and Philip was passed out at the controls. I checked him for life signs. He had a diabetic stroke and had died. Before I could say anything about what I was seeing, the plane dived downwards. I heard my sister and everyone screaming. I was not able to get to my sister. The plane slowly went down and crashed and slid onto the hot desert floor. It then hit a sand hill and the plane ripped apart in 2 pieces of the impact. Glass, fire and metal flew everywhere as I felt a very piercing pain in my left eye from a piece of metal. The air pressure suction threw me outside onto the desert sand floor with great force. It felt as if someone had grabbed me up under my shoulders and suddenly snatched me out, pulling me upwards. The impact of my fall knocked me out for about 20 minutes, I would imagine, from my watch. I woke up to see the plane about 200 feet from me on fire. I was not able to see clearly because my left eye was injured from the crash and the blood was pouring out of my eye down the side of my face and onto my chest. I went to touch my eye and the pain from the injury was so intense, I screamed out loud, dropping to my knees. I was no longer able to see properly out of my left eye. I also suffered an injury on my right leg across my calf that tore my flesh almost down to the bone. I looked towards the seating part of the plane in a fear that my sister had died in the crash. She was all I had left of my family. It was only the two of us left. I shouted my sister's name and ran on that bad calf to the plane. I went inside struggling, gasping, through the smoke and fire praying that she was still alive. She was still inside the plane strapped to her seat. Everyone else was dead. I shouted her name hoping that she was still alive. I went to her checking for signs of life. She was alive, but her abdomen was torn open terribly, and the seatbelt was pushing into her wound. She was bleeding so much and looking up at me in my eyes as to ask me for help. She was not able to speak because of the belt being too tight, preventing her from breathing properly. She too had the look in her eyes that I was all she had left. We needed each other to survive. We were forever twins born 3 hours apart during a cold winter day in December 2, 1933. I struggled to get the seatbelt open, but I wasn't able to. I ended up having to cut it loose with a hunting knife I had in my possession. I was getting her out of the seat with panic, in fear that the plane would soon explode. I had this fear because the fire was spreading due to the desert wind beginning to blow harder. I looked across the inside of the wrecked plane and I saw that the flames had covered the two of our other friends. I saw them, and out of love and fear of her death, I acted impulsively against the circumstances. I accidentally jerked her too hard and broke one of her ribs because there was another part of the seatbelt that I needed to cut. She screamed from the pain, but I cut the rest of the seatbelt loose and got her out and away from the plane about 300 feet. I laid her down in the sand and took my jacket off to cover her wounds to keep the sand out of them. I got down upon my knees beside her. I looked down at her as she lay there looking up at me with this look of peace in her eyes. I asked her if she was okay. She looked up at me and she asked me a question with the wind blowing the desert sand past her face. She smiled at me so humbly, so beautifully. Yes, and then she said to me, "Brother of mine, promise me that you will live." I looked down at her in a saddened fear. She spoke to me as if she knew that she was dying. I felt that she was leaving me. I thought she was saying that to me because we were twins and she wanted me to continue to live so that a part of our family would survive. But that was far too superficial in understanding for such a young man as I. I had no idea that it would mean something so much more important than just words of a young woman who was passing on to the Creator. I thought, looking at her lay there, and never have I felt such love for my dear sister. I thought of the many times we laughed as children. It was as I could see those times again and hear those laughs echo in my mind, as well as the desert wind and hills around us. I just looked at her and my mind spoke in fear and hurt, a helplessness. San Jessica, my sister, so many years. So many years I have helped my sister through things of this life, but now, O Lord God, when she truly needs help, I am helpless. I can't do anything to save my dear sister from death's door. I told her, "I will live, San Jessica, so will you live." As I looked away towards the desert in the direction to where I would look for help, San Jessica suddenly told me, softly, "Don't cry for help. You must have faith, help will come to you." I looked back down at my sister in confusion, and suddenly her eyes closed. I looked at her, screaming her name and shaking her, but she did not answer. I cried out, and as I cried out, the plane drowned out my cry with exploding. I covered my sister with the top of my body to keep her from getting hit by any metal or anything else. After the explosion had calmed, I took my jacket and covered my sister's body with it from her midsection to over her face. I stood to my feet looking down at her covered body, and I could not believe that it was ending as this for the two of us. I felt so betrayed by God, and so helpless and useless in regards to life. That moment, no matter of how much I have studied, no matter of how much I have sacrificed for the sake of truth, I knew that moment that life would forever be a mystery to me. A mystery in all of its turn of events, a mystery in each sun that reveals and that rest, that never seemed to give us a formal experience that would give us a warning of things as this, if not the slightest implication. I guess if we could have that gift of foresight, the world would be a much worse place. It would be a world that would be created and ran by a species of selfish and sickly ambitious fools. I looked towards the night desert with a fear that was mysterious because of my lack of knowledge of the desert, but a reality because of the sheer presence of reality itself that was a cold shadow besides me and which caused a fear within me that was gripping, great in feeling down to the very core of my being. It was so dark and foreign to me. Never did I ever think for the many times I had flown across the Sahara, would I ever be a prisoner of it, a lost wanderer who would leave his life-related numbered footsteps and blood upon its sands. But, I was worse than that of a wanderer, because I knew not where I was going and the purpose of walking while being lost seemed without purpose or meaning. I prayed, Lord God, Creator of heaven and the earth, I know that I am getting ready to go through something very trying if not to my death. Your word says that a righteous man's footsteps are ordered by you. All that I ask of you, my Lord, if I am seen as a righteous man in your sight, is to walk with me. Walk with me, my Lord. O Lord God, please guide my every footstep and cause me to fall upon your divine will. After I took a deep breath, the most important walk of my life began. I walked about 100 yards away from the area of the crash and suddenly the plane exploded again from the second gasoline tank being ignited from the fire, and this time the fire had spread in every direction, including the direction of where I left my sister. I saw the impact of the explosion violently raise the sand to the air in a scatter. I knew that she had died, if not only from her wounds, but the fire as well. Life, things as this are so very hard to understand. We have a false understanding of life because of the image we have of the course of life due to our own selfish indications. A misunderstanding that one event that happens tells us how to understand the next. Some events are just what they are in principle, in fact. In life sometimes the answer is within the question itself. I walked with intense pain from my injuries for the next 5 hours as the night fell upon me. I covered my right eye to see how much I was able to see out of my left eye, and I was not able to see anything. I had lost all of my sight in my left eye. I could feel a piece of metal inside of it as I moved it, and I was losing a lot of blood. My leg was beginning to feel numb as I walked. I did not know why I was walking or where I was going. My looking at all of the desert space, the wind spoke a feeling of desolation to my mind and spirit, thus, it all seemed pointless, hopeless. The enemy wanted me to give up and die out there. But regardless of what was happening, I noticed my mind recognizing the beauty of that night in the Sahara Desert. I until this day have never seen such beauty. The stars were out and the crescent moon was shining brightly. It shined a beautiful moonlight upon the desert sand floor. The wind was blowing and it looked as if there were glowing body forms of sand racing across the desert as spirits. It had seemed to have a calming effect on me as medicine to a burning flesh wound. I thought of why at a time as this, am I still able to see beauty in anything, in a time such as this after the death of my sister? I thought as the shock and hurt of the situation was causing some form of denial within me, in the sense of subconsciously trying to escape the reality of the common affects of a time as that. I thought openly to God and had grieved loudly to God with my hands raised halfway to the heavens and my face looking upwards. Is this how it ends, O Lord? For, after all I have done in your holy name in my mind and heart, O Lord, how have I sowed such a night as this? Why have my sister met such a death as she has, O Lord? I fell to my knees and wept in the sand as it blew against my flesh from the wind, becoming suddenly stronger as if even its rush was intensifying the trial against me. My head fell between my hands and I bowed my face into the sand. After a few minutes after the winds calmed, I sat up. I sat there for an hour grieving to God, to my own fear, to my own lack of faith. After a while, rationality set in my mind and spirit. I come to realize that God did not owe me anything. It was I who owed. The proof was, I survived the plane crash. I could have died easily, but God was merciful, and there is purpose in mercy. I thought of Hagar, the second wife of Abraham, and how she was out in the wilderness running between the hills looking for help. I thought of how when she was getting ready to give up, she placed her child on the land and was ready to die until the well of Zam-Zam began to bring her and her child nourishment. I then suddenly was reminisced of the words of my sister, "Don't yell for help, help will come to you." I suddenly heard my sister's voice, clear and filled with a faith that was imbuing to me, "Stand up, Benjamin." I opened my right eye, and as I was wiping my tears away, I noticed a brighter light beaming down in front of me from a bright star by the crescent moon, as if it was outlining for me a path to venture. I then suddenly heard again a voice in the air, as if there was a man crying out in the wilderness. The wind would cause the voice to come and go closer and then away. I began to walk. I started to thirst very much, as also the wind started to blow more with a very cold breeze. My flesh began to tremble as I walked, and my prayers became very sincere as the winds increased once more. I again heard the voice in the wind. It sounded as if it was closer. After I sat for another time waiting for the high winds to calm, I began to walk again until I walked upon a huge sand hill that looked almost as a small mountain to climb. I thought that I heard again crying in the winds, but this time I heard a sound as a camel bray. I walked over the sand hill that took me about an hour to do. After I got over it and was walking down the other side, I saw a group of camels walking through the desert upon the sand trail between the sand hill that I was on and the other one on the other side of the trail. It was a caravan of 14 camels carrying men. As I was trying to walk down the sand hill, I suddenly fell from my injured leg, and I rolled all the way down the hill and onto the sand trail not too far from in front of the caravan. I struggled to my feet, yelling for help and waving my hands to signal the men who were riding on the camels. Once I got closer to them, I saw that they were, of course, Muslims. I, still wearing my Catholic collar of the priesthood and knowing the traditional incompatibilities within the religious world of the Islamic community and the world of Catholics, I thought that I was staring death in its eyes. I impulsively took out my hunting dagger, expecting the worst to happen. When the leader of the caravan saw me, he sent up a hand signal and a yell for everyone to stop, as the others behind him signaled the others behind them. I stood there pale and dizzy from bleeding terribly from my eye and right leg, afraid, hurt from my sister's death, shaking and humiliated. Suddenly he signaled for his camel to lower him to the sand floor. The camel slowly lowered him to the ground, with the camel's knees hitting the sand with a heavy thud and a soft mumble from the camel. After a few seconds of stillness from him staring at me, the leader of the caravan slowly stepped down off of his camel and began to slowly walk towards me. The silence in this very moment was terrifying. All I could hear was the steady wind and the sand blowing across the sand floor. But the scene was dark, mysterious, and beautiful. He walked towards me as the wind blew his light brown, black and white garments and the moonlight shining on him, and then he stopped walking and stood still. History has taught us that Muslims are merciless, they are radical and evil. I had these teachings sitting in the very bowls of my fear. As I said, there was a tradition of discompatibilities, and thus a taught and trained hate towards the Muslim world for generations. He stood not far away and looked me in, what it felt as, right into my inner soul. I could only see his intense and serious eyes. His name was Khalid Azim Abdullah. He removed his turban piece, the part from covering his nose and mouth, until I saw his face, and said to me, "It is the will of Allah that you have stumbled upon our path. It is Allah's will that we have also crossed your path, thus our paths are interloped. For everything that Allah wills has purpose, my friend. Does not your book imply this truth? The prayer that I prayed to the Lord God had reminisced in my mind as I stood there shaking with my dagger in my blood-stained and ashamed hand. You said in your word that a righteous man's footsteps are ordered by you. I ask you, Lord God, to walk with me and please guide my every footstep and cause me to fall upon your divine will. I thought of the falling down the sand hill and onto their path, but was this in God's will for me? Lord God, this can't be, these are Muslims. I thought to God. My religious prejudice caused me to question God's purpose for this happening. God's will, again, I could have died in the crash. Religion and its effects insidiously taught within the mind and spirit caused me to be blind of purpose according to the will of God. I stood there trembling in fear with my dagger in my hand as Khalid looked at my hand shaking. There is no God, but Allah, friend. Allah is the grantor of life and of death. I pray that Allah does not leave His decision for your destiny in your hands as you hold that knife, my friend. But, does Allah grant us choices? Does that knife belong to the man before your trial or to the man who stands before me broken by the will of Allah for a greater purpose, a purpose much greater than himself? A choice, he said to me. Even then I had a choice, either to live by my actions or to die by my actions within the situation. I was faced with the promise that I made to San Jessica. He said, I offer you our help and peace. Choose to live and allow us to help you, or continue upon your path of religious bias and die. I pray that you make the decision of a wise man that sees virtue in his life. I looked at him and began to tear up because it reminded me of the words of San Jessica. It was as if I could hear her speak to me once again, brother of mine, promise me that you will live. I told him, I choose to live. I dropped the dagger in the sand because then, her words made perfect sense to me, so much that the confirmation, the understanding was so overwhelming I fell to my knees. She told me, don't cry for help, help will come to you. The prayer said to God, I am getting ready to go through something trying, if not to my death. Khalid told me to choose and I chose to live. He told me, as he signaled for his men to come and help me, that they saw the fire by the brightness that was in the desert night sky and was on their way there to investigate it and to see if there were any survivors. I told him that there were no survivors. He told me as he placed his hand on my shoulder, looking me in the eyes, smiling, only Allah is the all-knowing and the all-wise, my friend. He told 7 of the men to go and investigate the accident and to report back to him when it was time. What I have been taught of these men, I did not see in fact. After we went forwards for another 45 minutes, we set up camp. I was placed inside a physician's tent. Khalid's physician told him that I needed surgery on my left eye or I would lose it. I was put to sleep for the operation. After the operation I slept for 3 days because of my loss of blood. My body had to rebuild itself after the operation. I did not lose my eye, but I would never have my sight in it anymore. While I was sleeping those 3 days, I remember one particular night coming in and out of my sleep of hearing the same cry that I was hearing in the desert as I walked. And also because of my hurt, seeing images of my sister as she lay upon the desert floor dying. I heard it as I also heard the tent cover flapping from the desert winds. I remember coming out of my sleep for a few seconds, turning my head sideways using the vision of my right eye, looking out of the bottom of the tent cover that was flapping open and closing. I saw them praying their 5 o'clock in the morning prayer called Salat. The cry that I heard in the desert winds was their call for prayer, call that they use in order to tell other Muslims to join them in prayer. The same as the church uses the church bell to call for service. I thought, that was the sound that I heard in the winds. Allahu Akbar, they would chant in their prayer, meaning, God is great. And no matter of what religion one chooses, we all agree, Yes, God is indeed a great God. The fourth day I awoke from the sleep freshly rested. I felt my leg was bandaged. I opened my eyes and noticed that I had a patch over my left eye from the operation. I touched the patch and suddenly I heard a voice in the same tent I was in. It was Khalid Abdullah. And for the first time, we talked as men. We managed to save your eye and your leg, but your recovery pertaining to your sight is the unfortunate conclusion of the operation, Mr. Bergstrom. Allah is merciful and generous, you still live. Yes. How do you know who I am? I asked. We learned of your identity from your personal information from your wallet, Father. Yes, of course, I said. There was another Muslim in the tent with us, who came over to me and sat me up to respectfully face the man who I was talking to, giving me a glass of water. He was a very eccentric-looking man. He was tall as I am, of the height of about 6'5" and thin. He looked as if he was painted as an oil painting, with a medium dark-skinned but yet reddish tone, very intense eyes and a beard that was rooted of incoming gray hairs. He introduced himself. I am Khalid Azim Abdullah. Even though they already had found out who I was, I reintroduced myself to him. I asked him where we were in the Sahara. He told me we were outside of Bardia and they were headed towards the Doklan oasis. He told me our plane had crashed not far from where the dinosaur bones were found. I noticed that there were two Muslims standing outside the tent at the entrance to give permission of anyone who desired to enter. Abdullah asked me of how I stumbled upon to their path. After I carefully told him, he spoke to me. Times as these are Allah's will. In what life has been given unto me by the will of Allah, has forever been a journey to acquire truth of Allah and myself. It is our acceptance of Allah's will for us that gives us the strength to live truly and freely with no conflict, my friend. I cannot tell you, as what has been taught to you through the years, that your sister's passing is unfortunate, when Allah's will is forever fortunate if understood correctly. I told him that San Jessica was a God-fearing woman, and a good-hearted woman. She helped me many times during our travels doing God's work. He said. Then never speak of those who have passed on to Allah, who did the will of Allah, as dead. She lives in the presence of Allah, who is life consciousness itself, not death. And also in the memory of those who love Allah and her example through the will of Allah, giving her life within your own mind of her physical memory in the present. It is life after the death of the flesh and into another realm of life existence. It is we who are with the dead, she is with the living. I found myself agreeing with what he said. I have never heard anyone talk as he did with such wisdom. It was new to my physical ears, but it felt true to my spirit. It felt familiar in a place within me that was suddenly awoken to a new and yet already imbued understanding. I began to weep. The eyes pouring tears, purging them as the rain pours from the heavens by the will of Allah, purging the earth to bring forth new life abundantly. It is a purifying period that you are experiencing this moment. Have no discomfort in your growth, my friend, in its pain, and no fear. Only have consciousness of growth and acceptance into what Allah wills for you from this time forth. It was as he was able to see right into me, and not only saw what I was already able to see, but he was able to foresee things, which I had not been able to realize. Suddenly another man walked into the tent by the name Akim Aziz Abdullah. He was Khalid's younger brother. Akim gave his brother the greeting, As-salamu alaykum, meaning, peace be unto you, and Khalid gave him the return greeting of peace, alaykum salam, meaning, and unto you be peace. They spoke in Arabic of something, and after they spoke, Akim looked at me and said to me, it is rewarding that you are well, friend. Allah is merciful. He smiled at me and then left the tent. Khalid then smiled. My brother, he said of the young man, I am most pleased with him in his development, in his submission to Allah's will. I was concerned of him in the trying past when Islam was beginning to deviate from the original path of the Prophet Muhammad ibn Abdullah, peace be upon the Holy Prophet. We were, in some sects of a divided Islam, were not being patient enough for rational guidance and had began to think in terms of what is expected of Islam from a false analysis of a few who made mistakes which shed the blood of many Muslims and Jews. It has been the price that Islam has had to pay for because of our divisions and also the teachings in the Holy Quran. True Islam was then suffering a violent blow from its own members from their actions. I saw my brother in Pakistan going in the direction of death instead of life as Muhammad, peace be upon him, desired. I was blessed by Allah to acquire the counsel to help him to stay upon the right path. All praise is due to Allah. I began to understand from listening to him that history in the form of media is but a tool to give a false impression of different nations and their people. In the results does nothing but separate us from the true state of brotherhood and sisterhood in the sight of God, creating the worst forms of violence. In that separation, violence is evident. As with you, my friend, when you chose to allow us to help you, you chose life because of our availability by Allah's grace. Had you chosen otherwise, then you would have died as you walked further into death. I told him of my sister and how we were twins. I told him that I would have to get used to not having her in my life. When you are twins, then it is hard to do without the other. Yes, Allah spoke life into the womb of your mother once and created two beings. Yes, you are what are known in the world as twins, but does Allah ordain for the two of you destinies that are of different paths, as the two of you are male and female? Allah created us all from a single essence. The two of you are individuals within your own personal existences. Life is still with you as well as she, my friend. I thought of what he said of our destinies being upon different paths. I told him that I asked my sister to come with me to Africa, and it all ended with her dying in the Sahara Desert. I told him that I began to sense a feeling of guilt cultivating within me for what happened to her. I saw her as a victim of being upon a path that was my own. It should have been I who died. I said to him, only was I called to go there, not she. Khalid explained. Allah is He who chooses one's paths. Have no guilty feeling in your spirit, friend. If it were not the will of Allah, she would not have been with you at such a time. The will of Allah was that which inspired her to go with you, not any influence of your own. The paths that we walk upon belong to Allah's will as well as the path in which end with the flesh no longer functioning. After we talked more, I asked him if he had heard back from the rest of the caravan that went to the crash. He told me that he had not heard anything as yet. As we sat and talked more, suddenly some men came in the tent with food. There were many fruit-related foods. He told me that I needed to build up my strength. After we ate, I was given medication for my injuries and I soon fell asleep. This night would be the beginning of a trying time in the Sahara. That night as I slept, a scorpion stung me. I did not feel it sting me because the medication was so strong I was unresponsive to any external inflicted trauma. The sting of it caused me to develop an infection in my blood, causing a very high fever, and I fell into a coma while sleeping. When they tried to wake me, they found the scorpion dead by my injured leg where it had stung me. The medication that I was given was so strong that it killed the scorpion, and in the process, it preserved my life by fighting the venom from the sting. It was just not strong enough to not have kept me from entering the coma. Being in a coma, I was able to hear what was being said at times. Khalid was upset and did not want me to die. His physician checked me and came to a decision. If they were to save my life, they had to operate again on my leg. But, since I was in a coma, they were not able to give me anesthesia or it would kill me. I heard Khalid pause because he knew that my being in a coma and no anesthesia, it meant that I would feel the operation while they would be performing it. Allah be merciful and generous of the life of this man, I heard him say of me. As they were preparing me for my operation, Khalid's younger brother Akim entered the tent and told him that a storm was coming. I could hear Khalid pause and say to his brother, "O Allah, I pray that you do not sanction this man to die in my care. I pray that you are merciful and kind during your will of the storm." As they were preparing me for my operation, I could hear commotion building outside the tent because the wind had picked up quickly as an approaching wave of the sea. I could also feel the venom of the scorpion beginning to burn within me, trying to kill me. So there was a race of time, of life from the workings of the operation of the hands of men guided by God, and death from the desire of the venom that was inoculated within my blood from the enemy. My leg had started to feel as if it was on fire with a pain I had never felt before. I was not able to scream. But God was merciful because I passed out because of the pain, only to wake up still in the coma as the storm came. I could hear the men shouting outside the tent and the tent flapping from the high winds. The pain from the operation of the physical cutting the poison out of my leg was terrifying. I was only able to scream from within. The winds had become violent and I could hear the camels begin to become disturbed. The wind was blowing the sand against the tent, and Khalid had ordered the men outside the tent to get some camels and circle them around the tent to break down some of the wind's impact. As they were doing that, I heard a man get hurt trying to control the camel. He was as well brought inside, but for minor injuries. The storm lasted for 2 hours, but I had noticed at the time of when all of this was happening, I was able to hear men also shouting, "Allahu Akbar, God is great." Even in the midst of all of what was happening, they were still shouting to God of how great God is. It reminded me of Jesus as he walked calmly upon the raging sea. He, having such faith in God's protection and power, was also saying that God is great. After the operation was completed, my blood was checked to see if there was any more poison in it. They saw that all the poison was gone, but I was still in a deep coma and my condition was serious. My body had suffered so much turmoil that it was exhausted and felt that it itself needed rest in order to recuperate, to ensure itself life. As the winds continued to blow strong, the Muslims were beginning to sing praises to God. This lasted until the winds had calmed and the storm had passed. There was a silence for a while until I could hear some men outside sounding, as they were excited about something. Suddenly Khalid's brother Akim had entered the tent excited and asked Khalid to come outside of the tent to see something. I heard Akim ask Khalid, "Have you ever seen such a beautiful sight of Allah's doing?" There was a brief silence of their observation, and then I heard Akim say to Khalid, "Thank you, brother. Had you not loved me so, I would not be here to see such a glorious sight from Allah." I was later told that after the storm had passed, the clouds were broken up into large sections and the light of the moon was shining upon them as fire. The stars were out and were said as if they could be reached up and touched by the hands of curious men and women. It was the same beauty that I had seen when I had walked alone before I fell upon their path, which was the same path as my own, guided by the hand of God. I was in the coma for 7 more days. Khalid had decided for my health to stay where they were. My life was of a very sensitive issue to him because of the coma. Until one night as I lay there healing, I heard the Muslims getting ready for their 5 o'clock morning prayer. A steady wind had come and that was again causing the tent to move slightly. I was able to hear the bottom of the tent flap by my head. I had never heard such oneness, such sincere love for God, so much that it touched a part of my heart and mind. I felt tears stream from my eyes, as I lay there in a coma, unable to physically move, but moved from within. My mind uttered to my conscience, for I am a Catholic priest, whose life has been worthy of the care of these men whom are called Muslims. O Lord God, creator of heaven and earth, forgive me of my ignorance of this group of men who have been scarred by the hands of men whom are not worthy of your rewards. After so I had awoken from the coma. I looked outside from the bottom opening of the tent and saw the men facing the east to pray. I was most determined to join them. I carefully rose to my feet. The pain in my leg was lashing as a whip of flame, but I kept walking, limping. I walked outside the tent and saw them beginning to bow down, and as I struggled to get to them sweating with pain, urgency and eagerness, Akeem saw me. He smiled and walked quickly to me as he was looking back at his brother and the others whose backs were turned, and he said to me, "You should be at rest, my friend. What are you doing here?" I said to him, "I want to pray with you." He looked at me confused and said to me, "But you are not Muslim." I looked him in his eyes and asked him, "Do I have to be?" He smiled at me with such a humble and softness in his smile. He nodded his head and said as he helped me to walk towards the others, "Come." As the prayer began, Akeem stood me next to Khalid. As we were bowing in prayer, Khalid looked over at me smiling and I at him. After the praying was over, Khalid had yelled to the men as he turned to me, "Look at what Allah has bestowed upon us this day." Khalid suddenly shouted, "Allahu Akbar." The rest of the men also shouted the same over and over again with their fist raised in the air as Khalid came to me resting his hand upon my shoulder, still shouting the praise. They all suddenly crowded around me, patting me on the shoulders, laughing and cheering for my life. I smiled and also began to laugh. That very moment I thought of my sister and everything that had happened. I wondered of where my life would go from there. What direction was this experience pointing me towards? In the following time in the Sahara, I was one night sitting talking with Khalid and his brother. I was burning with curiosity of San Jessica and the crash and all. What I mean by all is, what now? The Lord had preserved my life, my sister and friends had died in the crash, and I had met such wonderful and compassionate men who I have grown to have a great deal of love and respect for. What now? Do I stay or do I return back to my life if that life is still there? And if I return, if it is still there, how will it be? What will it mean after such an experience? There was a sense inside me of a cutting off and a sense of a feeling of attachment of something new that was a mystery to me. There was a fear inside me as well. I wondered of what this internal growth of feelings and knowledge was taking me. As Khalid and his brother were talking, my mind wandered off into these questions, cultivating a stress and fear that was intense and very troubling. I suddenly excused myself from them as they were talking and looking at me as if they knew I was listening, and I walked outside of the tent. I walked away from the tent and stood still. There was a soft wind blowing and moving the sand upon sand floor. I could hear the wind blowing softly against my ears. I stared into the desert thinking of my sister and the crash. It was as though I could hear it all over again. I covered my ears as if it was too loud, with my face tightly clenched with stress, down towards the sand floor. I had wondered if the sandstorm buried my sister, and if so, I would never find her body for a proper burial. Suddenly I was given a vision of a woman walking towards me from the desert in an ivory garment in which the Muslim women wear. The moon was striking her garment and there was a steady wind blowing against her, and her face was covered. She suddenly called to me my name. It was my sister's voice. I was struck with an urgency and love. I called out my sister's name, and as I did that she suddenly vanished into the night wind and sand. I stood there in perplexity. After a short time standing there, Khalid Abdullah walked out to me and stood next to me. He asked me, "Are you all right?" I took a deep breath because there was a concern inside of me, because I needed to know the results of the crash investigation. As I continued to look out towards the desert, I asked him, "Were there any survivors?" He told me that there was no word yet. He was not even sure if the men survived the storm. He paused and said to me, "You know, I have another brother out there who was with them when they went ahead." "Truly?" I asked. "Yes. Adel Muhammad is his name." There was a pause between us, a pause that was ruled by a fear that seemed to cause the both of us to feel helpless. I spoke to him of it. While out there walking, I was at risk to accumulate a hate and anger for God. There are so many things in this life that we don't understand. There are so many experiences that we are given that feel so very unjust. It is as we live this life doing good things in the sight of God, but we are blessed according to another's life that we had lived in which we know anything about. It makes me feel as if to stand still, it makes me feel helpless as a man in a world doing well, but paying the price of one that has done only evil. I just don't understand anything anymore. I feel as though the giving of life and the loss of life is the greatest curse to man. In the losing, is there truly a giving? He too took a deep breath and said, "No matter of our own fears, the greatest fear is the lack of acceptance of the will of Allah or our own rejection of it. It alone brings the greatest pain inside us. What we don't know could hurt us in our sanity, friend, if we choose to dig into time. To try to intercede into time is not a reality. To assume that one can do such through his or her fears, will only lead to illusions that would soon serve as a self-destructive device. We must have faith and not be patient, but learn how to wait until Allah reveals what is hidden, in which our hearts and minds must know in the right time according to our gifts of understanding." I looked over at this wonderful man of wisdom and said to him, "No matter of what has happened, I am glad and blessed to have met you, to have known you." He smiled at me and looked back towards the desert. And there we were, two men from two different faiths standing together in stress of the same thing, both concerned of those whom we love. It is a shame of how religion itself has done nothing but separate mankind. However does God will circumstances in which bring us together upon a greater truth. I had decided to return home. The following morning after prayer we moved ahead. We traveled until we reached Benghazi off of the greater Gulf of Sidra. There we talked more. Khalid told me that he had a gift for me. He reached into his luggage and pulled out to me a Quran. Bergstrom revealed to me the other book he had gotten from the bookshelf. It was the Quran. It was the same Quran given to him by Khalid Abdullah. Until this day I still possess the gift in which he gave me. Khalid told me, "You may thank me for your life, but this is the greatest gift that I can give any man. It is my very being." I looked at him and felt such a love and respect for him. He shared his heart with me as well as his life. We embraced. He said as he held me, "Remember the bond we made, brother and friend, and pass this among our other brethren." I told him that I would. He said to me, "Our brethren." He included the Catholic as his brother, and also for I to treat other Muslims as my own brothers. We said our goodbyes. All the men and his brother wished me a peaceful journey back to America. They arranged for me to take a boat to Valencia, Spain. And from there I took a plane back to America. I traveled for about 19 hours, and all that time, I was thinking of everything and how I would explain San Jessica. It was a terrible feeling leaving her behind. After arriving in America in Chicago, I was picked up by the church and placed in the hospital for a week. They told me that the work that was done on me saved my life and all I needed was rest. After telling the brethren and also the Vatican about the experience in a letter to Rome, I was exhorted to Bishop. But during my return, for a long time I could not bear to hear anything about the desert. I was only able to know that the body of my sister was swallowed up by the storm of it. To think the image that her body was there buried in the sand was a gut-wrenching pain and humiliation. There was no funeral truly. We had just a small memorial with her picture gracing a wooded frame, when she was much more than that. Much more, and was loved by everyone. She always touched people's lives so gently. I remember another brother telling me that she reminded him of Mother Teresa and that she was to be the world's next great saint. After the memorial was over, I sat in that area alone for hours thinking of her. I never heard such a silence, which was so sad and empty. But, I noticed even in that moment, that there was an energy that was preventing me from the common department of grief. A living energy, Brother Daniel, that was strengthening me from willingly going to that level of grief that my own guilt was trying to convince me that I should go to be sane. I would soon find out what it was. But, for a long time I was distant during my personal hours. I had very little to say anymore during times with the brethren. I felt as if my inner self was melting due to a parasite inside me. For many nights alone in my room during prayer would ask God, as I would bow to my knees towards the night sky out of my bedroom window, of why God did not cause me death instead of her. I found it hard to understand the experience if it only lead me back to the same place, but without San Jessica. I would find out that I understood things in the carnal mind instead of the spiritual. 3 years had passed and suddenly there was a knock upon my door. I opened it and another priest had told me that there was an important package for me from overseas. I went to retrieve it and it was a letter for me from Syria. I was excited. I thought that finally Khalid Abdullah was writing to me. I had thought of him much and wanted to write him, but did not know of how to retrieve an address. I quickly signed for the letter and quickly went back up to my room. I closed the door and began to tear open the large envelope, not looking at the person who sent it, and threw the envelope upon the floor. I opened up a smaller envelope, unfolded the letter, and when I saw who wrote it, I was breathless for a minute. I dropped the letter. I quickly picked up the large envelope and read who sent it. San Jessica ibn Muhammad. It was my sister. She was alive. I was shocked as well as overjoyed and began to weep. After I got control of my emotions, I again looked at the envelope. I noticed the last name to be an Arabic last name. I knew that the letter would explain everything. I slowly picked up the letter and began to read. The letter from Syria. Dearest to my heart Benjamin, I greet you in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Compassionate, and in peace. I greet you in the abundance of life of the living oneness of God. I greet you, brother of mine, in love, in humility, and in the newness of life. I have regretted for the past 3 years of not writing you to assure you of my living. I know, as it has been, as for I, a terrible feeling of not knowing if you were with the living as I. I pray that you forgive me for my timing of writing you. As you can see from the envelope of my whereabouts and also my status as a woman, I am married now to a wonderful man of Islam by the name of Adel Asis Muhammad. He was one of the many men who were with the caravan when they came to see the fire. He has been the beautiful angel in my life who came to me and saved me from death as it was trying to succumb me. I will tell you of my journey in this letter. After you gone away, the plane, as you know, exploded, would have died, but your jacket had saved me from further injury. As the past dear brother of mine, you protected me from the flames of life, covering me with your love, your compassion. I passed out, thinking that I was going to Allah to rest, and even then, as I thought of my dying, did I miss you. I was between the death and life because I was able to see you walking and grieving in the desert sands and its desolate paths. Still I was calling to you, my brother, as your guiding angel through the power of my love for you. But in my unconsciousness I felt life still inside me because I was able to feel the pain of my injuries. I knew that if I did not receive help, I would surely die. I fell into unconsciousness and was suddenly, after a time, awakened by an Arabian angel looking down at me with eyes of vitality and concern, with the light of the flickering fire from the plane flashing against his face. It was Adel Muhammad. He yelled to the others that I was still alive. They came to me and checked me. The physician said that I needed a blood transfusion and immediate surgery, unless I was going to die. I saw the look in the eyes of Adel. He looked as if I was going to die. Lost and then found in the wilderness of the sands and its winds as a precious dove, wounded with broken wings. The physician instantly ordered for my blood to be checked. He saw that I had the same blood type as Adele. It is a responsibility for the physician to know everyone's health. Adele and the others quickly set up an environment to where the transfusion and surgery could transpire. After so, as I lay there, Adele was looking over at me with eyes of determination, his face flexing with every squeeze of his hand as his blood beautifully graced my veins. I fell into a deep sleep because my body was in such terrible condition. I was woken up weeks later while in Turkey in a hospital. I was kept sedated for the entire sleep. There was a nurse changing my for. She saw that I had awoken, she smiled at me. "Good morning, love," she said to me. "Where am I?" I asked her. She told me I was in Turkey. She suddenly looked towards the door of the room and Adele was standing there looking at me with such humbleness in his expression. The nurse walked out as he was getting a chair that was next to the door. He placed it to the bed and gently took my hand with both of his hands and kissed it and said, "Allah be praised." I was in the hospital for 90 days recuperating. He stood by me the entire time talking to me and bringing me flowers. He told me about the storm and how 2 of his men were lost who were to go back to report about the crash to Khalid Abdullah, the caravan leader. "Yes, brother of mine, Khalid Abdullah, whom loves you so." Adele is Khalid's second oldest brother. Akim is the youngest of them. Then one morning Adele asked me to marry him. "We are family now, brother." After I was released from the hospital, we were married in Turkey. And then we went to Adele's home, which is Syria. Our family is growing, brother. For I gave birth to a beautiful baby girl who is now 1.5 years old, named after the first wife of the Holy Prophet, Khadija. You have a beautiful niece, Benjamin, who has your eyes. Allah has blessed our lives, dear brother. I pray to hear from you soon, to see you soon here in this land. I pray that Allah bless you in all things. Salam, brother Benjamin. In peace and understanding. San Jessica ibn Muhammad. After I read the letter, I felt such a lift from my spirit. I then truly knew what freedom was. I was a prisoner of the past for 3 years of not knowing and yet only believing the worst, but now I was free. It explained the vision I saw in the desert of the woman wearing the Muslim garments that called to me. I saw the future for my sister and I. I came to understand that the entire experience led me to another place inside indeed. It was based upon principle, the other place within my mind and heart. And the living energy that I felt inside after the memorial was the fact that she was not dead, she was alive. I was led to a better understanding of many things and also was being exalted to a more personal relationship with God. Always keep your mind and heart open to all things, brother Daniel. It is essential and the essence of God. He smiled at me as he folded the letter back up and placed it back into his Quran. He stood up and walked towards me. He gestured with his huge hand for I to stand with him in front of him. He told me to give him the Quran. I handed it to him. He kissed the book and then said silently, "Blessed be the Holy Prophet." He then raised the Quran to his forehead, rested it upon his forehead and then handed it back to me, smiling, tapping it with his hand. He said, "If anyone asks you of where you got it, you tell them that you received it from me." He smiled at me and I him. You sleep well, brother Daniel, and thank you. It was most pleasant to share my walk with you. As I walked back to my room, I was struck with such a love and respect for him. And strangely I could feel the spirit of my mother walking with me. It whispered to me that she indeed loved him and he loved her. After spending a week there studying the Book of Thomas and sharing with other priests what I accumulated from my studies, I was ready to go back to the other cathedral to complete my work there so that I could go back and rejoin with Bishop Bergstrom and the rest. Bishop Benjamin Bergstrom gave me my first collar and uniform. I was eager to begin my life in the ministry, and so I put my collar on under my shirt and trench coat. I saw a clear path in front of me. I began to see value in the entire ideal, and the agenda of finding my father became suddenly as my mother truly intended inside me. It made perfect sense to find him and to help him to see the error of his ways. I headed back to St. Mark Cathedral and Orphanage. Written by David Anthony Brayboy.